a federal relocation office, somewhere outside New York. Two children sit in a waiting room. New paperwork sits in front of them. New names, new birth dates on new documents, their old identities, erased in a single afternoon. They do not choose this. Their parents chose it for them. Years later, one truth would separate this family from every other story told about the American Mafia. The children did not just lose their name because of their father's crimes. They lost it because of what their mother chose to become. This is the story of how survival, when it comes wrapped in secrecy, can cost a family more than the violence it was designed to escape. Karen Hill did not begin as a Mafia wife. She began as a young woman from a stable, disciplined household on Long Island, raised by a father who distrusted men who made money without explanation. That distrust became prophecy the moment she met Henry Hill in 1965. He carried himself like a man untouched by ordinary rules. Reservations appeared without calls. Cash moved without paychecks behind it. Her father hired an investigator, uncovered Henry's ties to organized crime, and forbade the marriage outright. Karen married him anyway. This decision would shape not only her life, but the lives of the children she had not yet had children, who would inherit a surname built on concealment before they were old enough to understand what that concealment cost. She was not a criminal by nature. She was a woman who mistook danger for devotion, who learned early that asking fewer questions meant a calmer household. That instinct, inherited silence, would later become the exact trait her children would need to unlearn in order to survive under new names, in new cities, as different people entirely. By the early 1970s, Henry Hill was embedded within the Lucchese crime family's structure, operating under Capo Paul Vario alongside associates like Jimmy Burke. The hierarchy was rigid, a boss insulated from street-level risk, capos managing crews beneath him, and non-made associates like Henry earning constantly, belonging never. Karen's household absorbed this hierarchy without naming it. Furs, jewelry, unexplained cash. Children raised inside rented luxury, funded by hijackings and loan sharking they were too young to recognize as criminal. As pressure mounted from federal investigators, Henry needed places to store evidence, narcotics money, weapons, stolen goods. Karen allowed her home to become that place. Her children grew up inside a structure built on two currencies, money and silence. Both were spent constantly. Both would eventually run out. By the mid-1970s, Henry crossed a line every Mafia hierarchy enforced. Without exception, he began trafficking cocaine, defying Paul Vario's explicit ban on narcotics. The families understood what law enforcement had learned since Prohibition. Drug charges brought federal scrutiny no bribe could neutralize. Karen watched the paranoia escalate inside her own home. Guns replaced silverware in drawers. Phone calls shortened. Children were told to stay upstairs during certain visits. On May 11, 1980, federal agents arrested Henry on narcotics trafficking, charges the kind of charge carrying mandatory decades in prison, and the kind that made him a greater danger to his own crew than to himself. For Karen, this was the moment survival replaced loyalty as the operating principle of the household. Her children would feel the consequences of that shift long before they understood its cause. To understand why this arrest threatened the entire family's existence, the political history matters. In 1963, Genovese soldier Joseph Valachi testified before the U.S. Senate, exposing the internal structure of La Cosa Nostra for the first time in American history. His testimony gave federal investigators a working map of the hierarchy they had struggled to penetrate for decades. By 1970, that map became a weapon, the RICO Act, allowing prosecutors to dismantle entire criminal enterprises as single conspiracies rather than isolated crimes. By the time Henry was arrested in 1980, federal prosecutors understood exactly which pressure points broke organizations like his. Non-maid associates, men who earned for the family but were never fully protected by it, were the weakest link in the chain. Karen's children were not spectators to this political machinery. They were its next targets, whether the government intended it or not. A family under federal pressure does not shield its youngest members from consequence. It exposes them to relocation, secrecy, and eventual identity loss, the quiet collateral damage of a war fought in courtrooms, not streets. Federal agents approached Karen before they approached Henry, understanding that wives inside organized crime households often held more evidentiary knowledge than the men they were married to. She was shown the scope of what prosecutors already had: wiretaps, financial records, evidence tying her home directly to concealment of narcotics proceeds. She was told plainly ignorance would not protect her from charges of her own. Simultaneously, suspicion mounted within Jimmy Burke's circle that Henry might cooperate with investigators. In this world, an arrested associate was not merely a legal liability, he was a security risk that experienced crews neutralized permanently. Karen was invited to a private, one-on-one meeting with Burke. She avoided it. That decision may have preserved her life, but it also confirmed something she could no longer ignore. The family that had provided 15 years of protection now viewed her and her children as loose ends. For the first time, isolation was not metaphorical. It was structural, deliberate, and closing in from every direction at once. There was no gunfire in this execution. What was executed was an identity, an entire family's name, history, and community, dismantled in a matter of days. Henry, facing life imprisonment and convinced Burke intended to have him killed before he could testify, agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors. But his cooperation required more than his own testimony. It required his family's complete removal from public existence. The Witness Protection Program did not simply relocate Henry. It erased the entire household's legal identity, including the children's. New names were assigned, new birth records created. Every document that once tied them to their extended family, their schools, their childhood friendships, was severed permanently. For Karen's children, this was not a choice they made. It was a decision made above them, executed through them, a consequence of their parents' crimes, inherited without consent, at an age when identity itself was still being formed. Marshals oversaw the transition with clinical efficiency. Boxes packed, papers signed. A family driven into an unfamiliar town, under names that had no history attached to them, no grandparents who could visit, no hometown they could ever mention again. Karen's own later reflections described the process as a kind of disappearance, not death, but erasure, absorbing everyone attached to her, whether they had chosen the danger or simply been born into it. This is the deeper cost obscured by every cinematic retelling of this case. It was not only Henry and Karen who vanished that year. It was two children, given no vote in the matter, whose names were the first thing sacrificed to keep their parents alive. Henry's testimony helped convict Paul Vario and contributed to prosecutions tied to the Lucchese family's broader criminal network, including cases connected to the 1978 Lufthansa heist. For federal prosecutors, the outcome validated decades of strategy dating back to Valachi's original testimony. For the family itself, protection brought no resolution. Henry's continued instability, including further legal trouble, and struggles with addiction repeatedly threatened the safety the relocation was designed to provide, forcing additional moves and renewed secrecy. Karen and Henry eventually divorced. Their children grew into adulthood carrying names that were never truly their own, inherited from a decision made during a crisis they were too young to understand, tied to a surname connected to organized crime, informant testimony, and a mother whose choices had determined every subsequent chapter of their lives. The public version of this story, dramatized in film, centered Henry as its protagonist. The quieter, less examined legacy belonged to the children who spent their adult lives distancing themselves from a household defined by concealment long before they were capable of consenting to it. Return to that federal office. New paperwork. New names. 2 children too young to understand what they were losing. That moment reveals the true mechanism of organized crime's damage, not the violence itself, but the identities quietly erased in its aftermath. The Mafia does not only cost lives. It costs names, histories, and the inherited right to know exactly who you are before someone else decides for you. Karen Hill's children did not choose the Mafia. They did not choose their mother's silence, or their father's crimes, or the federal machinery built to dismantle both. They inherited a name changed by other people's decisions, and spent the rest of their lives learning how to become someone else entirely. The paperwork is still being signed, somewhere in memory. New names. Old wounds. A family still disappearing, long after the danger passed.